Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here, and I do apologize for my absence. This is event season at Cornell, and I had competing commitments the last 2 days, but I'm delighted to join you all and to be asked to serve as discussant for the panel that is to come. This is where I find a lot of my very diverse research interests converging and hope to learn a lot from today's panelists. So I am going to announce the entire panel at first in the order of appearance. Our first speaker will be Ahsan Kamal, who is assistant professor in the National Institute of Pakistan Studies at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. Professor Kamal earned his PhD in sociology from the University of North Carolina, at Chapel Hill. Our second panelist, who I believe will be joining us virtually, is Vastavikta Bhagat, who is an assistant professor of architecture at the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai. And Dr. Bhagat's research focuses on the spatial and environmental politics surrounding post-intensive mining landscapes and climate change in Indian cities. Our third presenter today is Professor Nayanika Mathur of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at Oxford. Professor Mathur is the author of Crooked Cats, Beastly Encounters in the Anthropocene. So with that, I welcome all of our presenters and invite Ahsan Kamal to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about some of my work. So my paper is about the cultural production of activists who are wrestling with the existential threat of caused by North India's crisis and southern locations. The paper and presentation are still preliminary, in particularly when I refer to the title, the Daira and the Sentinel, as some ideas or forms that are emerging from social movements and activists. I'm still to work through a lot of the details on what are the implications of thinking with this. But one of my main concerns today is more sort of inward looking in sort of the ways in which these cultural productions from movements are brought into the academy and often used to theorize. And this has been a recurring question that has been coming up. How do you theorize from these other locations? What does that mean? From South Asia, from movements, what I term as southern locations in particular. So I will be talking a little bit about the Daira and the Sentinel and other forms like the Karakoles and the Loksat, but not to get too much into the details or the background of these movements themselves. So as one of my shared concerns here is what is the interdisciplinary study of climate change and cultural production in South Asia offer for a deeper understanding of the current climate crisis. And this is a vocational concern as academics gathered here. But I'm also interested in the utility or futility of what I call Southern theorizing. And so before I get into that, I wanted to invite you to sort of try to immerse yourself in this figure. This is from the floodplains of the Koh-e-Salman mountain range in Pakistan in central Indus Valley, right close to the Indus River itself. And this was a hotspot for the 2022 floods. And it's a long stretch of land with very similar sort of types of climate change effects happening there. And so the picture is more of an image of ruination. And that's an idea that I thought, a picture that depicts the destruction that's happening on the ground. But it's often just translated into numbers and stats such as 33 million in Pakistan impacted by the floods. And then these stats on lives lost and houses damaged become the foundation of the loss and damage claims. For instance, Pakistan spearheaded the 2022 loss and damage campaign by the Global South nations at COP27, last year. And the idea is to claim loss and damage for the destruction that the climate effect is already unleashing. But what does that mean when that sort of this image is translated into something like that stat that global North leaders in particular, global South leaders ask for? So it's an invocation to attend to this ruination in this image, which becomes the foundation for such claims that imagine a future. So what is that future? So I'm going to go through Estamos solos, como hace 25 años. These are the words of Subcomandante Insurgente Moises at the 25th anniversary of the Zapatistas in Chiapas, South Mexico. 25th anniversary del inicio de la guerra contra el olvido. The 25th anniversary of the war against the forgetting or the forgotten. So it's a very sort of, I'm not going to get into too much detail about the Zapatistas. I circulated a reading in the reading group. We had some conversation around that. I imagine most people are familiar with this movement that emerged in 1994 and was part of this big wave of anti-globalization movements that had, they wouldn't particularly classify themselves as anti-globalization as such, but very place-centric movements across the global South, the rise of the indigenous people movements, of all sorts of environmental movements in a moment where obviously we were already very deep into this path of the climate disaster or the climate crisis, as I would claim. But the discourse among these movements wasn't as much of a framing of climate crisis or climate change at the time. And so after 25 years, something interesting with this play of words, estamos, we, the plural, solos, alone, the condition of being alone, and not in plurality. So there's something interesting and that's happening, and especially just contrasting with this image right there. This is the Zapatis AZLN in one of their self-governing areas, Caracoles, La Realidad, on the 25th anniversary. And as the spiral sort of indicates, their movement also has this idea of being like having a center, a core, grounded in a place, and then spiraling out at different levels. It's also an invitation for engagement with the others along the path at the different levels, let's say the national level or international level or universal, planetary, what you may. And the movement was very significant during that period, a vibrant period where a lot of movement thinking happened in these spaces as well as in convergences, academic activists, engagements, lots of literature that came out at that time. As I go on to say that I classify that as the convergence. But the reading that we discussed, this is just a small fragment from that same reading. And the idea of the sentinel that they present is like someone who's watching, standing at a watchtower and looking what's happening, observing what's coming, to foretell people. So partly that invoking that image as communities and movements who are seeing, and they say a storm is coming, a perfect storm. And there's a us versus them kind of thing going on here as well, we. But the we here isn't necessarily we, the Zapatistas, the indigenous, that community. It's a very central question of method of investigation, in fact. A praxis that, of politics, of knowledge making as well. Now, again, I'm not going to go too much into detail of what they mean by the we. But reading this in the reading group, I also sort of thought of, okay, this is a question for academics as well, right? That particular we. And the tendency to resort to the same tactics, the necessity to ask other geographies, calendars, histories, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of like a methodological sort of framework, if you may, of thinking about these challenges in the long term. And But how does that sort of same thinking happen in the academy is what I really mean by the terms arrivals and convergence. So this is part of a couple of other papers that I've written with another activist academic based in the North. We started as, activists and graduate students gathered in the US and thinking about doing South-South collaborations, but then centrally confronted with the idea that the North is always there, that the roads lead through North. So we, in fact, had converged in the North. And of course, we are sitting in South Asia, so no one knows more about the difficulty of South-South travels and mobilities than our particular region. But even with long distance, like across Africa or to other parts of the world, Latin America. And so we kind of developed some sort of framework around, it's a popular conversation around decolonization, so we're rehashing some ideas but using slightly different terms. So one of the paper was around where's the North, and we had to kind of come up with the definition as the North as the orientation towards the capitalist colonial world, imagined in the 70s by the Brandt Commission, with the 1970s established by Robert McNamara. But sort of like that's a definition we find useful, and then we define Northness as a relational quality that creates a strong tendency to orient towards the North. And it's, in our understanding, it's both an epistemic and geographical and social category. So at the intersection of this, based definitely on geographical location, but not just the hemispheric North and South, but the network that is the North and the South in terms of thinking about capitalist colonial systems. The social position largely understood in the nation-state sort of societal level framework of race, class, gender, different forms of stratification. And then the institutional vocation, we at the time particularly were thinking about activism with these kind of movements and academics, the dual places that we were inhabiting ourselves. But it could be applied to policy thinkers and all sorts of other sort of vocational challenges in terms of knowledge production. So that's kind of like where we say that there's a quality of Northness depending on your location, position, and vocational tendencies. And this kind of like, also gonna skip this, but this is a sort of a periodization based on generally what you see in decolonial literature, that the first encounter was at the colony between the colonizers and the colonized. It is also an epistemic encounter that births theory proper with a capital T, and also all sorts of decolonial thinking that comes in response. Then there's the post-colonial arrival, which Arif Darley calls he I think uses the term the conquest of the first world academy by the third world intellectual. He has in mind the trinity of Said, Baba, and Spivak. But the basic idea is that there is a certain degree in which these southern bodies migrate to the north and become influential, very influential, like in all sorts of academic disciplines, also criticized in many ways within the academy as well as from outside as being distant from the movements, the subaltern that they're talking about. So that sort of criticism existing. And the conversions, which I mentioned in terms of the Zapatistas. So the idea really is that I think for theorizing, what we took away from it is that you have to have like a certain sort of degree of Northness to claim the authority and the power to theorize. And in terms of academic, that's being in the academy in the north, or the northern circuits that circulate throughout like all sorts of geographies. But how do we think about this ruination, like thinking from these spaces of movements? The southern ruination where south, in the imagination, is a place yet to be north in the development theories, or a radical alterity and plurality, which is the radical discourse. But it's a place that is almost in ruins. It's no longer there for many of the places. I mean, just recent Israel-Palestine situation is just another sense of evidence of that. So I'm going to shift now to the last part. Can I get a sense of time? I'm sorry, I'm bad at timekeeping. 5 minutes? All right. I'll quickly go through the daira. So some of the forms that I'm using, I'm just experimenting here. I'll come back to it. But this is a fragment from a letter to the inspection panel. Now, inspection panels are internal accountability mechanism by Asian Development Bank or the World Bank when they're investing in different projects. And you're supposed to see if you're following your own policies and regulation around indigenous people. And lots of these battles, hard-fought battles, translated into policies and procedures. So this is a letter from Chashma Loksat, a movement from that area. I'll show you this on the maps, which says, we're gathered in the Daira Deen Pranad. Daira means circle, which is represented here as well. And, you know, it's a moment of truth, almost. The sitting in the Daira at informing the inspection panel is in the context when the inspection panel has supposed to be go around in the field and decides to disengage with this kind of social movement-led community-based forums. They eventually did make it to one of the gatherings called the Lok Sat, Lok, Log, folk, Sat, Sat, say, you know, it's kind of like together, people's gathering. But I also want to point to the idea that this is written in 2004. When this project was being built, it's a large canal project. Let me just maybe show you a little bit of that. So it's as you can see in the center, between the Indus River and the mountain range, these canals were built. And these canals are built, now you can see the Indus River and some of the old canals. These aren't the canal that I'm talking about. But you also see these mountain and hill torrents. So they're directly in clash. They're heading towards each other. The canal is going to block the path of these rivers, and that's kind of like the schema. The Indus River to the rightmost, to the east. Then you have this shaded area as the command area, the area irrigated by the canals. But you can see the canal line boundary is just completely blocking the paths of these hill torrents. And in the 2022 and earlier, this has been a huge reason for the disaster, because these flood waters from the and there's a complexity of this disaster. I mean, it's just not as simple as that. But I can go into that if in the question answer if needed. So this is way before the disaster. When the canal is being built, people are already in grief, and they're saying that when the river dies, and the river is again, imagine not just the Sindhu, but also all these other streams and nalas that are feeding the Sindhu with silt, sedimation, and the whole cycle of rains and river, as we've also discussed in some of the readings. And so it's not just the heart, I die, it's not just the river dies, it's the eyes die, the heart dies, the identity of being and living dies. It's not just the pair of the swan that dies, but the entire laughter. So these are verses used in these movements, produced by and this is a testimony from a recent campaign. So that was like 2 decades ago when the canal was being built, when people were saying, stop it, don't do it, this is going to destroy it. And now the destruction is there. And these are the testimonies being sent. We are actively part of a campaign. If I had time, I could show you some of that material. But we are actively doing a campaign, just focusing on the idea, what is the scope of the project? Just tell us the scope of this project in the temporal and spatial the awareness that we have developed by thinking of climate change and Anthropocene and anthropogenic. So, and you know, this is just a visual images of how this destruction, I'm just looking at the landscape here. But you can see this canal being destroyed, the embankments, because it's a gradient, so that embankment is there to protect the canal from the hill torrents. But when a massive flood comes, it destroys it. And that's on the upstream of the canal, so on the side where you'll have a lake form. So it's a kind of a lake bed form. And then when the lake bursts happen, it's kind of like a GLOF event, but it's called local lake outburst flood. So the lake forms, it deposits the sills. You can see the fields being leveled. Usually these boundaries are like 2-3 feet. In some places, the sill deposits are 8 feet high. And then when the lake bursts, you have this kind of destruction in the downstream area. Like these are all houses. I'm not showing a lot of other graphic images. And it's like really like, you know, this guy is just showing the crops that were lost or the ghalla, stored ghalla. And you have these recurring canal problems that are going to happen every year or every 10 years or every 5 years. And the crop loss is for this previous year's crop, the standing crop, and the next few years as well, because you're unable to rebuild and reconstruct. So I'm going to sort of wrap it up here. But the forms that I'm putting up here are the ways I'm trying to imagine what's going on. So this is representing the arrival to the north. And not an arrival just in a physical location, but also becoming part of the institutional practices that gives you some sort of symbolic and cultural capital to theorize, essentially. And we can talk about the problem of theory itself and theorizing itself, but setting that aside, it's just a recognition of the power one has in the epistemic kind of world. And then these movement forms that are often retrieved and brought into the academy by, let's say, the arrived through convergences and all sorts of other ways. But what happens in that translation when we theorize from here versus from the movements? Often when we cannot even imagine the conditions, like it's okay to sort of say that, yes, we cognitively understand what's going on here. But that immersion in that space, in that world, is very difficult to imagine and kind of like bring us back. So what are the forms and the concepts that people who are there are producing? And how do we not retrieve them and report back to the academy, but what are the ways? And I have some thoughts on that as well, but I'm going to end here, and thank you.